Sarah Johnson's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she maneuvered her weathered 2008 Toyota Corolla through the crowded streets of downtown Providence. The digital clock on her dashboard blinked 5:54 p.m., 6 minutes until Riley's pharmacy close. In the rearview mirror, her 8-year-old son Marcus's reflection showed his lips taking on a subtle bluish tinge, each breath becoming more labored than the last. "Hold on, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Mama's going to get you there." Her eyes darted between the road and the mirror, counting her son's breaths the way the school nurse had taught her. The empty inhaler rattled uselessly in Marcus's small hand, a sound that would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. The evening traffic crawled at an excruciating pace. Sarah's McDonald's manager uniform still smelled of French fries from her morning shift, a shift she'd left early when the school nurse called about Marcus's asthma attack. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, probably her younger sister Ashley, watching the other two kids. Another bill she couldn't afford to pay this month. 5:56 p.m. The pharmacy's familiar green sign came into view, but so did the sea of cars lining both sides of Jefferson Street. Sarah's heart sank as she approached, scanning desperately for a space. There wasn't a single legal spot in sight. Then she saw it, an empty space right in front of the pharmacy's entrance, marked clearly with "No Parking," fire zone signs, and bright yellow curb paint. Marcus wheezed harder, the sound cutting through the car's interior like a knife. Sarah glanced at the dashboard clock again. 5:57 p.m. The decision crystallized in her mind with stark clarity. Her son's breath was worth more than any fine. She pulled into the no parking zone, hazard lights blinking to life with a quick press of a button. As she helped Marcus from the back seat, she noticed the security camera mounted above the pharmacy's entrance, its red light blinking steadily. Later, she would remember this detail with bitter irony. "Come on, sweetie," she encouraged, supporting Marcus's increasingly unsteady steps. The boy's school uniform was wrinkled, his tie loosened in a futile attempt to make breathing easier. His brown eyes, so much like his late father's, were wide with fear. The motion sensor doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of air-conditioned atmosphere. The familiar antiseptic smell of the pharmacy wrapped around them as Sarah guided Marcus to the counter, where Mr. Riley, the elderly pharmacist, was already preparing to close up. "Please," Sarah called out, her voice cracking slightly. "My son's inhaler. We need a refill." "I have the prescription." She fumbled in her purse for the crumpled paper, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Mr. Riley glanced at the wall clock, 5:58 p.m., then at Marcus's distressed face. Without a word, he took the prescription and moved quickly to the shelves behind him. Sarah held Marcus close, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her side, silently praying that her decision to park illegally wouldn't come back to haunt them. What Sarah couldn't know, as she stood there counting the seconds until Mr. Riley returned with the life-saving inhaler, was that the security camera above the entrance had captured everything. In 3 weeks' time, this footage would become the spark that ignited a national conversation about justice, mercy, and the impossible choices parents sometimes face. But for now, in this moment, Sarah Johnson was simply a mother watching the clock tick toward 6:00 p.m., holding her breathing-impaired child, and hoping that sometimes doing the wrong thing for the right reason might be enough. The municipal courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Providence County Courthouse felt more like a freezer than a hall of justice. Sarah Johnson pulled her thin blazer, borrowed from her sister Ashley, tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the McDonald's logo on her uniform underneath. She hadn't had time to change after her morning shift. Her relief manager had shown up late again. Judge Michael Thompson's courtroom had none of the warm wood paneling or dignified atmosphere she'd seen on TV shows. Instead, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting unflattering shadows across the faces of those waiting their turn before the bench. The wooden gallery benches, worn smooth by years of anxious defendants, creaked with every slight movement. Docket number 247. Sarah Johnson, parking violation in a fire zone. the court clerk announced, her voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd called thousands of similar cases. Sarah's legs felt like lead as she approached the podium. Judge Thompson peered down from his elevated bench, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the fluorescent glare. His reputation preceded him. 23 years on the bench, known for his strict interpretation of the law. And, as Sarah had overheard someone whisper, about as flexible as a steel beam. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Thompson began, shuffling through the papers before him, "you parked in a clearly marked fire zone at 5:57 p.m. on March 15th. How do you plead?" Sarah cleared her throat, painfully aware of the small run in her pantyhose and the coffee stain on her sleeve. "Guilty, Your Honor, but please let me explain." "The court acknowledges your guilty plea," Judge Thompson interrupted, his voice carrying the practiced indifference of someone who'd heard every excuse imaginable. "The fine for this violation is $250. "Your Honor," Sarah's voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "I had no choice. My son, Marcus, he was having an asthma attack. His inhaler was empty, and the pharmacy was about to close. I couldn't find any other parking space, and he couldn't breathe." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably the babysitter again about this week's payment. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment as Judge Thompson's stern gaze bore into her. "Ms. Johnson," he cut in, each word precise and cold, "the law doesn't care why you broke it. Fire zones exist to save lives. What if there had been an emergency while you were blocking access?" "But it was an emergency, Your Honor," Sarah responded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "My 8-year-old couldn't breathe. Then you should have called an ambulance," Judge Thompson stated flatly, ignoring the murmurs of disapproval from the gallery. "The fine stands at $250, due within 30 days. Next case." Sarah stood frozen, her hands gripping the podium so tight her knuckles turned white. The courtroom security camera whirred softly as it tracked her movement. The same mechanical indifference she'd faced at the pharmacy that day. But this time, it was capturing a moment that would soon make millions of viewers question their faith in the justice system. "Your Honor," she tried one last time, straightening her spine the way her grandmother had taught her. "I work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table for my 3 kids. This fine, it means choosing between rent and groceries this month." Judge Thompson's expression didn't flicker. "The law, Ms. Johnson, is not a buffet where you can pick and choose which rules to follow based on personal convenience. You may set up a payment plan with the clerk." Next case. As Sarah turned to leave, a single tear escaped despite her best efforts. She wiped it away quickly, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Behind her, the clerk was already calling the next case number, the machinery of justice grinding forward without pause. What no one in that courtroom knew was that in less than 24 hours, this seemingly routine case would spark a nationwide debate about justice, compassion, and the true meaning of the law. The video began simply enough. A shaky phone recording of a courthouse security monitor, captured by a law student who couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Within hours of being posted to TikTok with the caption, "Watch how this judge treats a mother trying to save her child," the footage took on a life of its own. By midnight, the 6-minute clip had amassed over 2 million views. The comment section became a battlefield of emotions. "This isn't justice. This is cruelty wearing a black robe." Listen to how her voice breaks when she mentions her kids. "I'm sodding." That judge probably never had to choose between feeding his children and paying a fine. Sarah first learned about the viral video while on her break at McDonald's, when her coworker Tamika thrust a phone in her face. "Girl, you're everywhere." The familiar scene played out on the small screen. Sarah in her borrowed blazer, standing ramrod straight before Judge Thompson's bench. The security footage, though grainy, captured every nuance of the exchange. The slight tremor in her hands, the steel in her spine as she fought for understanding. But it was what happened next that truly captured the nation's attention. As Sarah turned to leave the courtroom, The camera caught a moment of raw humanity. She reached up to brush away that single tear, then squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, a gesture of dignity that resonated with millions. The comment sections exploded. That moment when she wipes that tear. That's every single mother who's ever had to fight a system that doesn't see her. Notice how she doesn't break down or get angry. The strength of this woman. This is what real courage looks like, facing injustice with grace. By morning, major news networks were picking up the story. The headline, "Justice or Cruelty. Judge finds mother for saving child's life," splashed across screens nationwide. Social media influencers began sharing their own stories of impossible choices faced by parents. #JusticeForSarah and #CompassionOverCourts started trending on Twitter. A local news crew found Sarah during her lunch break, the golden arches of McDonald's casting a shadow over her uniform as she tried to maintain her composure. "I'm just a mother who did what any parent would do," she told the reporter, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort with the attention. "My son couldn't breathe. The choice wasn't between right and wrong. It was between my child's life and a parking rule." The clip of her interview, set against the backdrop of her workplace, added another layer to the viral story. Comments poured in. "She's still showing up to work, still holding her head high, even with all this going on. Look at the difference between her dignity and that judge's coldness." This is what America's working mothers deal with every day: impossible choices and no mercy. Legal experts began weighing in, debating judicial discretion versus strict interpretation of the law. A constitutional lawyer's TikTok breakdown of the case garnered 5 million views. What we're seeing here isn't just about a parking ticket. It's about the fundamental question of whether our justice system serves the people or punishes them. By sunset, the original courthouse video had been viewed more than 15 million times. Media requests flooded Sarah's phone. "Good morning, America." The View, CNN. Her sister Ashley had to create a spreadsheet just to track them all. But it was the private messages that moved Sarah the most. Hundreds of mothers sharing similar stories of choosing between following rules and protecting their children. One comment, from a retired emergency room nurse in Seattle, went viral in its own right. "In 30 years of emergency medicine, I never once saw a tragedy caused by a parent parking in a fire zone to get medical help. But I've seen plenty of tragedies caused by parents who couldn't reach help in time." As Sarah tucked Marcus into bed that night, his breathing finally steady thanks to the new inhaler, she scrolled through her phone one last time. The view count on the original video had passed 20 million. What started as 6 minutes of security footage had become a national conversation about justice, compassion, and the daily battles fought by working mothers across America. Neither Sarah nor Judge Thompson could have known that this was only the beginning. Judge Frank Caprio's morning routine hadn't changed in 20 years. Coffee with 1 sugar, a quick scan of the Providence Journal, and 15 minutes of quiet reflection before the day's cases. But this morning was different. His iPhone, usually silent until noon, buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues, family members, and even his grandchildren, all sending the same video. "Frank, you need to see this," read a text from his son, followed by a link to the viral courtroom footage. Settling into his leather chair, the worn fabric creaking familiarly beneath him, Judge Caprio pressed play. The morning sunlight filtered through his chamber's Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across his iPad screen as Sarah Johnson's story unfolded before him. He watched it once, then again. By the third viewing, his coffee sat cold and forgotten on his desk. "Mary," he called to his assistant of 15 years, his voice unusually thick. "Clear my next hour." Mary peered through the doorway, startled to see her boss remove his glasses and press his fingers against his eyes. A gesture she'd witnessed only twice before, when his wife passed and when his youngest grandson was born prematurely. "Are you all right, Judge?" she asked, stepping into the chamber. "No, Mary, I'm not." He turned the iPad toward her. "Watch this. Tell me what you see." As Mary watched, Judge Caprio stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Providence. The same streets where Sarah Johnson had made her desperate drive were visible from his vantage point. How many other parents, he wondered, had faced similar impossible choices on these very roads? "It's heartbreaking," Mary said softly when the video ended. "That could have been any of us." "No, Mary," Caprio corrected gently, turning back to face her. "That's exactly the problem. It couldn't have been any of us. That moment, that choice between a parking ticket and a child's breath, that falls hardest on those already struggling to breathe in a system that too often forgets its humanity." He returned to his desk, pulling out a legal pad. Mary recognized the look in his eyes, the same one he got before making one of his famously compassionate rulings that had earned him the nickname, the People's Judge. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," he said, beginning to write, "and get me everything you can find about Sarah Johnson's case. Court records, witness statements, everything." "What are you thinking, Judge?" "I'm thinking it's time we had a conversation about what justice really means in America." He paused, looking at a framed photo on his desk, himself as a young attorney standing beside his immigrant father. "My father used to say that mercy without justice is weakness, but justice without mercy is tyranny." As Mary turned to leave, she noticed Judge Caprio's hands trembling slightly as he reached for his phone. She'd seen that tremble before too, when he was about to do something that would make headlines. The next hour found him poring over similar cases from his own courtroom. A grandmother who double-parked to rush her diabetic grandson to the hospital, a father who ran a red light to get his daughter to the emergency room, a mother who couldn't afford the registration renewal but had to drive her child to chemotherapy. Each case file added weight to his conviction that something had to be said. Something had to change. When his clerk knocked to remind him about his first case of the day, Judge Caprio was already drafting what would become one of the most watched judicial responses in social media history. But first, he had one more call to make. "Hello, Sarah Johnson. This is Judge Frank Caprio from the Providence Municipal Court. I wonder if you might have a moment to talk." On his desk, the iPad still displayed the paused video, frozen on that moment when Sarah wiped away her single tear. Behind her, barely visible in the grainy footage, hung the words carved into the courtroom wall, "Equal justice under law." The irony wasn't lost on Judge Caprio as he waited for Sarah to respond on the other end of the line. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest injustices happen not when the law is broken, but when it is followed too blindly. What he couldn't know was that this phone call would change not just Sarah's life, but the very way America thought about justice. The Providence Municipal Court's largest courtroom had never been so crowded. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like artificial stars. Sarah Johnson sat in the front row, her McDonald's uniform replaced by a modest blue dress borrowed from her church's donation box. Beside her, 8-year-old Marcus fidgeted with his inhaler, now never far from his reach. Judge Frank Caprio had insisted on doing this live, refusing pre-recorded options from major networks. Some things, he told his staff, need to be felt in real time. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Municipal Court of Providence is now in session, the Honorable Judge Frank Caprio presiding." The 86-year-old judge emerged from his chambers, his black robe settling around him like a mantle of authority. But today, something was different. Instead of taking his seat at the bench, he walked down to the courtroom floor, removing his reading glasses as he approached Sarah. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him a beloved figure in Providence, "would you join me up here, please?" The livestream counter ticked upward. 100,000, 250,000, 500,000 viewers. Sarah rose, her hand smoothing her dress nervously. As she walked forward, Judge Caprio did something unprecedented. He pulled up 2 chairs, setting them face to face in front of his bench. "I'm not here today as a judge," he said, gesturing for Sarah to sit. I'm here as someone who has watched our justice system forget its most fundamental purpose, to serve humanity. The camera zoomed in as he continued, his voice thick with emotion. 47 years ago, my son Frank Jr. had an asthma attack in the middle of the night. I broke every traffic law between my house and the hospital, every single one. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. Any parent in this room would have done the same thing. The live stream exploded with heart emojis and supportive comments. 750,000 viewers. 1 million. But here's what's different, Ms. Johnson. When I broke those laws, I was a young lawyer in a nice car in a nice neighborhood. No one stopped me. No one filmed me. No one fined me. His voice cracked slightly. The system worked differently for me than it did for you. Sarah's eyes welled with tears, but this time she didn't wipe them away. Marcus, watching from the front row, gripped his inhaler tighter. Your Honor, Sarah began, but Caprio raised his hand gently. Please, call me Frank. Today we're just two parents talking about what it means to choose between following the law and saving our children. The viewer count passed 2 million as Judge Caprio stood, walking to his bench to retrieve a manila envelope. I've spent 3 days reviewing similar cases from across the country. Do you know what I found? The poorer the parent, the more likely they are to be punished for making the exact same choices any of us would make. He returned to his seat, leaning forward. Ms. Johnson, you parked in a fire zone to save your son's life. I've heard some say you should have called an ambulance. Do you know what an ambulance ride costs without insurance in Providence? $1,200, Sarah answered softly. 3 weeks of my salary. The comment section exploded. 3 million viewers. The law, Caprio continued, his voice rising with conviction, was never meant to be a weapon against parents protecting their children. It was never meant to force mothers to choose between saving their child's breath and putting food on the table. He opened the manila envelope, pulling out an official document. This morning, I spoke with Judge Thompson. After reviewing the circumstances, he has agreed to vacate your fine. But then Caprio smiled, the warm smile that had made him an internet sensation. But that's not why I asked you here. Standing again, he addressed not just Sarah, but the millions watching. Today, we're announcing the creation of the Emergency Parent Protection Act, a proposed law that would shield parents from prosecution when acting to secure emergency medical care for their children. The viewer count hit 5 million as he turned back to Sarah. We'd like you to help us write it, because who better to help shape compassionate justice than someone who has felt its absence? For the first time since this ordeal began, Sarah Johnson smiled through her tears. Behind her, Marcus loosened his grip on his inhaler, just a little. The revolution in American justice had begun with a parking ticket. It would end with something much bigger. The transformation of Sarah Johnson's story from a viral moment to a movement happened at 3:47 a.m. when Emma Rodriguez, a night shift nurse at Rhode Island Hospital, couldn't sleep after her rotation. Watching Judge Caprio's live stream for the third time, she opened GoFundMe and typed, "Justice for Sarah," because no mother should choose between breathing and eating. Her initial goal was modest, $2,500 to cover Sarah's fine and maybe a few months of Marcus's asthma medication. She posted the link on her break, expecting maybe a few $100s from fellow nurses. By sunrise, the campaign had raised $50,000. By noon, it hit $150,000. The comments section became a tapestry of American healthcare stories. $25 donated. My son has asthma too. Could have been us. $500 from the Providence Nurses Association. We see these impossible choices every day. Taking my coffee money for the month, $100, and giving it here instead. This matters more. But it wasn't the money that moved Sarah to tears as she sat in her small apartment's kitchen, scrolling through her phone while Marcus and his siblings ate breakfast. It was the letters. They arrived first as emails, then as physical mail, so many that the post office had to hold them separately. Dear Sarah, one began, written in shaky handwriting. I'm an 82-year-old grandmother from Maine. In 1965, I lost my daughter because we lived too far from the hospital and couldn't afford an ambulance. I've carried that guilt for 57 years. Today, watching you fight for your son gave me peace. You did what I wish I'd been brave enough to do. The media descended again, but this time, Sarah was ready, standing outside her McDonald's workplace, where her manager had proudly given her time off for interviews. She spoke with quiet determination. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about every parent who's ever had to choose between following rules and saving their child. Then came the mothers. It started with a Facebook post. Bring your inhalers. Bring your stories. Bring your truth. At 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, 12 mothers stood outside Judge Thompson's courthouse, each holding an inhaler above their head in silent protest. By noon, there were 50. By 3 p.m., hundreds filled the street, creating an image that would grace newspaper front pages across the country. They came with signs. Breath is a right, not a privilege. Justice without mercy is no justice at all. Would you fine your own child for breathing? Among them stood doctors, nurses, and paramedics in uniform, holding their own signs. We took an oath to save lives, not follow parking rules. The photo that captured the nation's heart wasn't of the protest's size, but of its smallest participant. 4-year-old Luna Martinez, sitting on her mother's shoulders, holding a hand-drawn picture of stick figures, one of Sarah, one of Marcus, and one of Judge Caprio, with a heart connecting them all. Sarah's inbox filled with more than just support. Parents began sharing their own stories of impossible choices. A father who jumped a median to rush his diabetic son to the ER. A mother who ran 3 red lights getting her daughter to the hospital during an allergic reaction. A grandmother who violated parking laws to get her grandson's epilepsy medication. Each story added fuel to a growing national conversation about the intersection of justice, healthcare, and poverty. The GoFundMe, meanwhile, had evolved. Emma Rodriguez, overwhelmed by the response, partnered with local healthcare advocates to create the Breath First, Pay Later initiative. The fund would help cover emergency medical transportation and parking fines incurred during medical emergencies for low-income families. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Sarah received an unexpected letter, hand-delivered to her apartment. Inside was a photo of a young Judge Thompson, holding his own daughter in a hospital room decades ago. The note read simply, "I forgot what it meant to be a parent before being a judge. I'm sorry. Some lessons come late, but they come." That evening, as Sarah helped Marcus with his homework, her phone buzzed with another notification. The GoFundMe had passed $300,000, but she wasn't looking at the money. She was reading the latest comment. "I'm alive today because my mom broke the law to save me 30 years ago. Today, thanks to you, Sarah, maybe the next mother won't have to choose between law and life." The revolution that began with a parking ticket was becoming something greater, a reminder that justice without compassion is no justice at all. For the first time in his 23-year career, Judge Michael Thompson's parking spot at the Providence County Courthouse remained empty on a Monday morning. His clerk found a brief email. "Taking a personal day. Reschedule all cases. No explanation. No signature." Just 12 words that broke 2 decades of perfect attendance. Inside his Victorian home in the historic district, Thompson sat in his study, surrounded by law books and framed certifications that suddenly felt less meaningful. His television played CNN on mute, showing footage of the mother's protest outside his courthouse. He watched his own face appear on screen, clips from Sarah's hearing that had now been viewed over 50 million times. His granddaughter, Rachel, a newly qualified nurse at Rhode Island Hospital, hadn't spoken to him in 6 days. Her last text message still burned on his phone screen. "I watched a child die last night because his mother couldn't afford an ambulance and was too scared to break traffic laws getting him to us. Is this the justice you're so proud of, Grandpa?" The morning sun cast shadows through his study window, creating prison bar patterns across the newspaper on his desk. The Providence Journal's headline glared up at him. A Tale of Two Justices, When Law Meets Humanity. The article contrasted his ruling with Judge Caprio's response, complete with a poll showing 92% of Rhode Island residents siding with Caprio's approach. His wife Susan entered quietly, placing a cup of tea beside him. "Michael," she said softly, "do you remember when Rachel had her first asthma attack?" Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the tea. Of course he remembered. It was 1989, before he'd become a judge. They'd rushed her to the hospital in their Volvo, running 2 red lights. No one had stopped them. No one had questioned them. No one had forced them to choose between a fine and their child's breath. "We were lucky," Susan continued, touching his shoulder gently. "We had money, a nice car, the right address. We never had to think about what it meant to be afraid of the very system meant to protect us." The weight of 23 years of rulings pressed down on him. How many Sarah Johnsons had stood before him? How many desperate parents had he judged without seeing? His phone buzzed. Another call from the media. He'd been declining interviews all week, but the pressure was mounting. The story had evolved beyond a viral moment. It was becoming a national referendum on judicial compassion. Standing abruptly, Thompson walked to his desk and pulled out a legal pad. For hours, he wrote and rewrote, trying to find the right words. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to fade, he picked up his phone. "Hello, Sarah Johnson. This is Judge Thompson. I wonder if we could talk." The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats before Sarah's voice came through, steady and dignified. "Yes, Your Honor." "No," he corrected quietly. "Today, it's just Michael. A parent who forgot what it means to be afraid for your child." What followed was a 2-hour conversation that would later be described by both as transformative. Thompson listened as Sarah shared not just her story, but the stories of countless others who had reached out to her. Stories of parents criminalized for choosing their children's lives over legal technicalities. As the sun set over Providence, Judge Thompson made 2 decisions that would reshape his legacy. First, he drafted an official opinion vacating not just Sarah's fine, but reviewing similar cases from the past 5 years. Second, he agreed to join Judge Caprio's initiative, bringing his expertise in legal procedure to help craft legislation that would protect parents in medical emergencies. That evening, he sent 2 text messages. The first was to his granddaughter Rachel. "I was wrong. Help me make it right." The second was to Judge Caprio. "Sometimes it takes a parking ticket to show us where our justice system has failed. I'm ready to help fix it." As night fell over Providence, 2 judges, 1 mother, and countless supporters began the hard work of transforming a moment of viral outrage into lasting systemic change. The revolution that began with a mother's choice and a judge's coldness was becoming something more, a blueprint for reform. When Judge Thompson finally returned to his courtroom 3 days later, something fundamental had shifted. Above his bench, he hung a new sign, small but visible. "Justice tempered with mercy is justice served." 6 months after a parking ticket changed America's conversation about justice, the Rhode Island state capitol buzzed with anticipation. The marble halls, usually echoing with lobbyists' footsteps and political debates, today resonated with something different. The sound of inhalers being raised in solidarity. Sarah Johnson stood at the podium in the main chamber, her McDonald's uniform replaced by a professional blazer, purchased with her own money from her new job as Community Outreach Coordinator for the Emergency Parent Protection Initiative. Marcus sat in the front row, alongside Judge Caprio, and in a sight that still surprised many, Judge Thompson. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "I broke the law to help my son breathe. Today, we're here to ensure no parent has to make that choice again." The chamber was packed. Mothers who had participated in the inhaler protest filled the gallery. Healthcare workers in scrubs stood along the walls. Local news cameras rolled as Sarah continued, gesturing to the thick document before her, the Compassionate Justice Act. "This isn't just a law about parking tickets," she explained. "This is about recognizing that justice without compassion isn't justice at all. This act provides clear guidelines for law enforcement and judges when handling cases involving medical emergencies." The act, co-authored by Judges Caprio and Thompson, with input from medical professionals, parents, and legal experts, outlined comprehensive reforms: protection from prosecution for traffic and parking violations during documented medical emergencies, creation of designated emergency parking spaces at all pharmacies, establishment of a medical emergency transportation fund for low-income families, mandatory judicial training on medical crisis intervention, implementation of a compassion-first response protocol for law enforcement. Judge Thompson rose to speak next, looking markedly different from the stern figure who had fined Sarah half a year ago. "My entire career, I thought justice meant applying the law equally," he admitted. "I failed to understand that true equality sometimes requires us to recognize unequal circumstances." His granddaughter Rachel, now head of the Emergency Parent Protection Initiative's Medical Advisory Board, wiped tears from her eyes as he continued, "We're not just changing laws today. We're changing how we think about justice itself." From the back of the chamber, Emma Rodriguez, the nurse whose late-night GoFundMe had started the movement, watched the livestream counter tick past 1 million viewers. The fund, now transformed into a national nonprofit, had helped over 3,000 families with emergency medical transportation and legal support. Judge Caprio, speaking last, removed his glasses and looked directly at the cameras. "This act isn't just about Rhode Island. It's a template for every state in America, because a child's right to breathe shouldn't depend on their parents' bank account or zip code." The vote was unprecedented, unanimous passage in both houses. As the governor signed the act into law, Marcus rushed to hug his mother, his inhaler clutched forgotten in his hand, a symbol of how far they'd come. But the day's most powerful moment came afterward, in the Capitol's rotunda. Judge Thompson approached Sarah, holding a small plaque. "This will hang in every courthouse in Rhode Island," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. On it was inscribed, "The Sarah Johnson Principle. Justice must breathe with the same urgency as those it serves." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself alone for a moment with both judges. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "that a parking ticket could change so much?" Judge Caprio smiled. "It wasn't the ticket that changed things, Sarah. It was your dignity in the face of injustice." Judge Thompson added quietly, "and our willingness to learn from it." That evening, as Sarah helped Marcus with his homework at their kitchen table, now in a better apartment, thanks to her new job, her phone buzzed with a message. A mother in California had used the act's template to challenge a similar fine. The judge there had not only dismissed the case but had ordered emergency parking spaces installed at all local pharmacies. The revolution that began with a desperate mother's choice and a cold judge's ruling had transformed into something permanent. A reminder that justice, like breathing itself, must make room for life's urgent moments. Sarah looked at Marcus, breathing easily as he worked on his math problems, and smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like parking in the wrong spot for all the right reasons.